Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, I'm going to go over one of my other classics. This is the series of Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Now, similar to my Wizard of Oz books, these were popular at the time they were written. And the first book, Anne of Green Gables, which is the book that most people are actually familiar with, was published in 1908. So these were written kind of at the turn of the century, similar time period to the Oz books. Completely different demographic. For one thing, Lucy Maud Montgomery was from Prince Edward Island, where the majority of her stories in this book take place. She did spend some time in Nova Scotia as a child. She actually spent most of her adult life closer kind of to the Toronto area of Ontario. So I believe that's where she was spending time. I could be wrong. At the time, and this is kind of true today, some people still look at the author and connect her to the Anne character. And she did not like this because it makes no sense. And it really makes no sense. Anne Shirley, or Anne Bly, as she becomes known later in books after she gets married, had a much, much happier life than Lucy Maud Montgomery. She was an extremely intelligent woman who married a very unintelligent man who, because of his religion, came to believe that her and her children and him were destined for hell no matter what. So yeah, they were pretty much doomed to eternal damnation no matter what the heck they did, because that's the way things were gonna go. So they were both very depressed. She actually contemplated divorcing him at some point in time, according to what I've read, right around the time she nearly died of the flu back in the 1917 Spanish flu pandemic. And it is rumored that she committed suicide. So she actually had a pretty miserable life. She is buried on Prince Edward Island, where she lived. I know, seen it. I visited there on my honeymoon. It's absolutely utterly beautiful place. Anne of Green Gables very much centers, is a huge deal on that island. It's a huge tourist attraction. The island attracted people who are obsessed with the books even back when they were written. In fact, from what I read, Montgomery's, I believe her uncle, tore down her grandparents' house because he was angry at basically the popularity of the Anne of Green Gables stories and tourists. They do have a site there. I think they say that it actually belonged to her aunt and uncle, is the house that they show. So, and I think they were in the middle of building like a huge complex there when we were there. They were building a giant building. They had gotten a grant. It is considered a heritage site. You can visit some of the places that inspired the books. It's like, mad warning here. And this is a story behind there. Many, many years ago, an American English teacher who was teaching in Japan, after she left her copy of Anne of Green Gables in Japan, and her co-teacher supposedly translated it. And I believe it's part of their school system now. So Anne of Green Gables is very, very big in Japan. So that's kind of an odd thing to say in this review. But now let's kind of move into the books. So I've read everything up the first, looks like I've read the first 6, which is Anne of Green Gables, Anne of Avonlea, Anne of the Island, Anne of the Windy Poplars. It's also apparently called Anne of the Windy Willows in the UK and Australia, so didn't realize that. And then Anne's House of Dreams, and then Anne of Ingleside. Now, the first 2 books you would definitely read to your kids. That's not a thing. That's a thing. They're perfectly good to read to young children as read aloud books. The further the books get into it, things get a little bit more adult. So, as most people know, Anne of Green Gables covers the story of Anne Shirley, who's an orphan. She's accidentally brought to Prince Edward Island from Nova Scotia when, I'm trying to remember the names of the characters, but basically a brother and sister, Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, there we go, remember the characters' names, are looking for a boy to help on their farm. So neither one of them had married. They're brothers and sisters. No, there's no weird strange thing going on there. Remember, time period here. This book was published in 1908. So they ended up loving her and raising her throughout the story. So she pretty much, her parents died when she was little. She spent most of her life being used essentially as a servant and a nanny to other people's kids. So that's been her life. And when the Cuthberts realize that was her life, they choose to take her in and raise her. And she becomes much loved by both of them. Both Matthew and Marilla love her very much. So that is kind of the first Anne of Green Gables stories of how she's adapting to really being a child around, I think she's around 10 or 11 when the books start. And she's going to a one-room schoolhouse, and that kind of goes through her schooling, her kind of growing up. I believe Anne of Green Gables ends, unfortunately, with Matthew's death. Spoiler there, it's a very old book, though. But her graduating from Teachers College. So the next book, Anne of Avonlea, kind of chronicles her teaching on Prince Edward Island and kind of taking correspondence courses and kind of the life of the island and how things go along, and a little bit of her relationships with her friend who's a little bit wealthier, which is Diana, who doesn't go to the Teachers College. She doesn't move on to school. She gets married and has children, and that's kind of that's her life. Why Anne goes to college and becomes a teacher, and she's taking correspondence courses along with a gentleman friend of hers, Mr. Bly here. For some reason I can't remember his first name. They do eventually get married. They're adversaries at first, and they're also competing for the top place in the school. Anne ends up teaching at Avonlea School. Now, Avonlea does not exist. It is a fictional place. It's based on New Glasgow, which is where Montgomery lived with her grandparents and where she was born. Once again, beautiful place. I believe we stayed at a bed and breakfast there. Like I said, I have pictures. It's gorgeous. We had a wonderful time on that island. I can't wait to go back with my children. But back to the books. So Anne of Avonlea kind of chronicles that. So this is still great for kids. She's still doing some of the adventures. She talks about the children she's teaching and kind of her life with Morella, who is actually going blind, which is the reason she stays rather than going away to school. Now, Anne of the Island, it really does chronicle her time in school when she goes to a fictional town that's based on a school in Nova Scotia, from what I read. So she goes to basically a fictional school in a fictional small town, and she studies English. And this is where it gets a little bit more adult. You're talking a little bit more about courting. There's a point in there where she goes home on vacation, and one of her school friends is dying of tuberculosis, and she does end up mentioning that she does in fact die of tuberculosis. And they do talk about some of their friends getting married and kind of more adult topics. It's still okay, but it's one you probably parents particularly want to read first and see if it's appropriate for their children, because it is more of a teen audience, I think, with this book. Moving on to Anne of the Windy Poplars. This moves on to, we're getting close to where she's courting Gilbert Bly, that is the gentleman she's seeing, finishing up school, where she's just taking a degree in English, which I will tell you she does not use. I believe she does a little bit of writing, but Anne of Windy Poplars is very much, you are getting into the adult versions where things are, she's courting, she's getting married, she's finishing school, and things get older. Anne's House of Dream is where it really gets dark in life. Now remember, this book, Anne's House of Dream, was actually written in 1917. It looks like, when I'm double checking, Anne of the Windy Poplars I actually haven't read. It was a later publication written in 1936. So now that I remember, this is kind of her in between. This is talking about when she's a principal at a school on Prince Edward Island while she's waiting for Gilbert to finish medical school. So Anne's House of Dream I actually fully read. And this is when she and Gilbert move to a different place. They're living in a house on another part of the island. They're away from Avonlea, and he's starting his medical practice. He's there working with his uncle. You get some adult themes here. You get spousal abuse going on with a neighbor. Anne herself has a baby that dies shortly after birth. So that's kind of a darker, you get kind of the darker concepts. She does eventually have multiple children, but this baby girl basically dies in her arms, and it's a very hard birth. She does end up having a second child and multiple other children. She does quite a few kids. Later books, but that is very much of an adult theme, and you kind of see that as the stories move on. Anne of Ingleside is actually the last book I read. Again, this is talking a lot about Anne's life as an adult and her marriage, and I believe there are some issues with her husband's aunt who comes to stay with him, and she's criticizing them like crazy, and basically they want her to go away because she's kind of mean. It does still cover Anne giving birth again, having more children, and how they dealt with that with some of their younger kids. But it's very much more of a family book. You are seeing more of the regular life. And for me, unfortunately, it kind of starts to drag and gets kind of a little boring. And this book was written in 1939. So this was, again, Anne of Ingleside was later. So it looks like, I know Montgomery kind of went back and forth writing these books. She was not happy later in her life, but they were immensely popular. So there are a couple other books that she wrote that have Anne in them, but also cover her children. So you have Rainbow Valley, which was done in 1919. And then Rilla of Ingleside, which actually believe talks about her youngest daughter, Marilla, named after Marilla Cuthbert, who I'm assuming is dead by this point. She's actually alive through most of the earlier books, which is in contrast to the films, which I will get to. And I do enjoy them all. I think there are 3 or 4 of them. But then you have Rilla of Ingleside, Rainbow Valley are 2 of the later books in the series. And then you have some later books. The Blythes are quoted, which is short stories, which she actually finished writing right before she died. But apparently, from what I'm seeing, it wasn't actually published until 2009. So it's kind of interesting. She did, Maud Montgomery did write other books. They do get much darker from what I've read, because her life got darker and these things reflect more on her. So, but Anne Shirley in these books is very much the mother figure, the child growing up, becoming kind of a teacher, getting an English degree, but then pretty much settling into life as the doctor's wife. So, like I said, it varies. Anne of Green Gables, Anne of Avonlea are definitely great to read to young kids. They're great read-aloud books. Anne of the Island, Anne of the Windy Poplars, Anne's House of Dreams. As you get later, things do get darker. I don't know. I haven't actually read Rainbow Valley or Rilla of Ingleside, so I'm not sure about those books. You might want to check them out. I'll see if I can review them at a later date. But like I said, once I got to Anne of Ingleside, things they began to drag, so they lost my interest. And that may be the mistake for you or your kids. But these books were still insanely popular at the time. So it looks like, if I'm looking at Anne of Ingleside, that must have been published right around her death, because I know she died, I believe, before World War II, I believe. I'm going to double check to see if I can double check where she died here. There we go. Yeah, she died in 1942. So, she was born in 1874. So these are the turn of the century books. They're great stories, at least the first 2. Most of them are out of copyright, so that's another bonus. You do get a look in the history. They also talk about an absolutely utterly beautiful place, Prince Edward Island. I hope to cover in a travel video, but that is a long way off. Going back to Eastern Canada, that's what me and my husband did on our honeymoon. We toured Eastern Canada. We went through Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, up through Quebec. So, great place. I would love to spend more time there. So, again, with this series, the first 2 books, you really can't read to kids. The later ones, be careful. just kind of read them. I know she has some short story collections. In fact, that's how I was introduced to the series. I actually learned about Anne of Green Gables from the Disney Canadian combination series Avonlea, which focuses on Sarah Stanley, which was a character she had in a short story called, I believe, The Storytime Girl. So that's where that character came from. And that's how I learned about it. I later saw the films. Only for this review and for this channel did I actually ever read the books. So that's kind of my story, my background. I loved Avonlea as a kid. It's a great memory of mine. That's the reason I desperately wanted to visit Prince Edward Island and want to take my daughter back, because it's a beautiful place to visit if you ever get a chance. The bridge there is very interesting. You're driving across the longest bridge over I believe, the North Atlantic. So it's an interesting way. I believe it costs almost like $40 as a toll, because they need money to upkeep a bridge that's going over the North Atlantic. But so that is my review of Anne of Green Gables and the series that goes along with it. I will definitely cover the films. I love them. I own them. They're wonderful. I honestly think Montgomery probably would have enjoyed the Anne of the films better than she ended up enjoying her character, Anne Shirley. She also she hated being compared to her because she was far more ambitious. And unfortunately, she was very much into being the wife and following the traditional way of the times, even though it probably didn't really suit her. As a highly intelligent woman, married, unfortunately, she made a bad choice. Her husband was obviously miserable because he was highly depressed, probably slightly crazy, and thought her and her children were all going to rot in hell because they were. No explanation. They were just, I think that was the religion. Only certain people get into heaven no matter what you do. So again, that's my review. The first two books are great. Be careful with the other ones, just because they get adult themes that you're dealing with marriages and miscarriages and violence to an extent. So that, there we have it. I'll stop rambling here. So if you like this review, like some of my other stuff, click like and subscribe. Otherwise, have a good night. Thank you.
Hello, and this is Tiffany from the editing room. After starting the editing of the Anne of Green Gables book series, I realized I should probably give a little bit more information on the last two books in the series, and that's Rainbow Valley and Rilla of Ingleside. Now, after looking at the Wikipedia page, which is where I got a lot of where I got all my images from, so thank you, Wikipedia. I happily support the Wikimedia Foundation because I use it incessantly, particularly for this channel these days. So I looked at the Wikipedia pages for these two books to kind of get a summary. It looks like Rainbow Valley probably would be child appropriate because it talks about Anne and Gilbert's children. So it's much more, and their kind of antics with the new minister's son. So it's a little bit more similar to, I'm guessing in tone, to Anne of Green Gables itself. Now, this was written, Rainbow Valley was written in 1919, which is interesting because the author nearly died of the Spanish flu right around this time. It was contemplating divorcing her husband. But once again, I haven't read the book, but it does look like the tone is focused more on the children and their antics and the life going on in Ingleside, which is where Anne and Gilbert end up making their home. So it focuses on their children. Here, I'll name them here. See if I find the name of the children here on this. There we go. Somebody. Looks like they're in Ingleside. Okay, so let's look at, I do believe this one, there we go, Rainbow Valley, I think describes, yeah. So the children, which are, you meet various times in the earlier books, are James Matthew, or Jem Blythe, Walter Cuthbert Blythe, Anne Nan Blythe, Diana Di Blythe, Shirley Blythe, who is male. This is one of their sons. What a special like that. Figured that out when I read the explanation for Rilla of Ingleside. and their youngest, who you learn about, and the last book that focuses on Anne, which is you have the birth of her, which is Bertha Marilla or Rilla Blythe. So those are the Blythe children, and this focuses on them and their interactions with the minister or the manse's children. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct. So he's a widowed minister whose wife died, and his children have pretty much been left to their own devices, so to speak. So they're a bit wild children. And the Blythe children kind of take them in and try to civilize them and realize they're actually very good people. So these become their friends and their neighbors. And that's what this book focuses on. So I would have to read it. I would recommend before you bring this to your children, that you do, in fact, read it. But it might be more child friendly. Now, Rilla of Ingleside is probably not. This book it came out. This is the last of the books that she writes about Anne, though she does have two sets of short stories. The Chronicles of Avonlea, the Further Chronicles of Avonlea, and then the Blythes are quoted. Now, the Chronicles of Avonlea was published earlier on back in 1912, and then the Further Chronicles of Avonlea was published in 1920. The Blythes are quoted is interesting. She finished this right before she died, but it was never published until relatively recently, as in 2009. So it was redone and published recently, even though, yeah, it was finished right before she died, which was, I'll have to look, this is going to tell me. I know she died right around, like early 1940s, so right around early World War II. So Rilla of Ingleside focuses on World War I with the children and having the sons of Anne and Gilbert going off to war during World War I, and Rilla and her sisters being left behind. Apparently Rilla's sweetheart, Ken Ford, was also sent off along with their playmates, the Meredith boys, Jerry and Carl. So they're all off fighting in Europe as part of the Canadian forces, and this book focuses on the home front from a woman's perspective of what goes on in the war. Now, according to this it's probably one of the only books that focuses on a woman's perspective in Canada during that time. So it must have been difficult. I mean, you can imagine. Obviously, Montgomery was alive, and I do believe her sons went off to World War II, or World War I, sorry, and she had firsthand experience of this. So it was difficult. So she wrote this book kind of in reference to that with her characters. Again, it was published in 1921. So this is several years after the end of the First World War. So I'm going to guess this book is going to have more adult themes, because once again, the kids are much older and you're talking about war. It does mention, the Wikipedia page mentions that it's one of the only Canadian novels written from a woman's perspective during the First World War. And it was also apparently one of the only one that's non-Australian that mentions I'm going to mispronounce this, Gallipoli campaign, and the sacrifices made by, looks like, the Australian and New Zealand forces. So that's probably something interesting. So it's, as opposed to some of the other novels, this may be a good book to read with older children if you're studying World War I. So it's going to give a home front perspective in the Canadian sense. So that's a little bit more on the other two books. See if I can give you a little bit more on the two short stories. So the Chronicles of Avonlea, which was written early on, it's a series of short stories, a couple different things that are going on, focusing, I'm assuming, on Anne of Avonlea. Anne Shirley does not really play a major part in these books, so looks like there's 12 stories in the collection. She really doesn't play much of a role, maybe a minor role in these stories, which makes sense because she may or may not have been home at this time. So it looks like the titles of these stories are Let's see, you have the hurrying of Ludwig. Okay. The courting of Prissy Strong. Let's see. Each his own tongue. Little Jocelyn. The winning of Lucinda. Quarantine at Alexander Abrams, and the end of the quarrel. Now, these are the ones that have Anne Shirley as a minor character in these books. Let's see. There's also referencing Marilla Cuthbert and Rachel Lynde, which are major characters. And the brief appearance by Diana Barry and the Reverend Mr. Allen and his wife, who were other people who were participating in the Anne of Green Gables books. So, looks like there's quite a few. So this is, like I said, this is a collection of short stories. It depends. Like I said, I haven't read it. It would probably be appropriate for young kids because when it is a collection of short stories, it does look like it's focusing mostly on children and the life of Avonlea. So that's probably a decent look, but I always read it first. So yeah, the full stories are The Hurrying of Ludwig, Old Lady Lloyd, To Each His Own Tongue, Little Jocelyn, The Winning of Lucinda, Old Man Shaw's Girl, Aunt Olivia's Beau, Quarantine and Alexander Abrams, Pa Sloane's Purchase, The Courting of Prissy Strong, The Miracle at Carmody, and The End of a Quarrel. Now, I'm guessing this is one of the these stories is where you get some of the plots for the TV show that was done as part of the films that I cover in another video called The Road to Avonlea. So this is where he's getting some of the creator of the films and the TV show are getting some of his ideas. Yeah, it follows. Some of these stories are used to base on the successful TV show Road to Avonlea, which is where I was introduced to the entire Anne of Green Gables thing. I saw the Road to Avonlea first, which aired on Disney when I was probably in elementary school. It was one of the things my parents actually allowed us to watch during dinner. So now the other short story collection published in 1920 was the Further Chronicles of Avonlea. So again, more short stories, probably still kind of appropriate for children. Yeah, the stories are, let's see, Aunt Cynthia's Persian Cat. Sounds pretty normal, child-friendly. The Materializing of Cecil, Her Father's Daughter, Jane's Baby, The Dream Child, The Brother Who Failed, The Return of Hester, The Little Brown Book of Miss Emily, Sarah's Way, The Son of His Mother, The Education of Betty, Her Selfless Mood, The Conscious Case of David Bell, and Only a Common Fellow, and Tennis Flats, which is interesting because there is another short story that she wrote that's not popping up here, which is called The Storytime Girl, which is mentioned, focuses on Sarah Stanley, who's the main character in The Road to Avonlea. Though it's not popping up here, I'm assuming maybe it was published somewhere else as well. And let's do a quick look. The Blythes Clodagh, which is the most recent book, because it was published. Yeah, it was published near the end of her, finished near the end of her life. Yeah, Montgomery died in 1942. So, like I said, it wasn't published in its entirety until 2009. So, this is the 11th book to feature Anne Shirley. So, let's see if it quotes where the publication history. No, it's not giving me the stories that were written. Let's see. Apparently there was an abridged version that was published, but it wasn't published in its entirety until 2009. So that's kind of a little bit extra on these stories. As I said, it depends on your child's mood and who they are and their age, which books in this series you want to read. I'll repeat this, always read the books first before you give them to your kids, because you don't want to get those surprises. Because, like I said, some of in my original review here, the later Anne of Green Gables books do get a bit darker. It's obvious that Rainbow Valley probably deals with more benign subjects, but Real of Ingleside does not. So again, you're dealing with World War I, which was a major thing back then. So, and as I mentioned in the beginning of my classics reviews, I wouldn't really judge these books just because they were popular at the time, and it was a harder life. I mean, kids were experiencing death, particularly later in the time when these books were published. The Spanish flu had happened. That really focused on young people. So there are people in their late teens, early 20s dropping dead like crazy. And of course, there was the whole very little trench war thing going on in World War I. So you had a bunch of men dying and people dying. So death was not something they were unfamiliar with, and nor would it would be have been pretty common they were familiar with death even earlier on, because they just weren't, the Victorians just weren't separated from it. You had wakes in the home. So you have a whole Victorian death culture, which oddly enough is an interest of mine. That's the reason I know about it, because I've studied the death customs of the Victorian age. But again, these more serious contexts of people were not always giving birth in hospitals. Women were giving birth at home. It was still pretty common. You had doctors making house visits. So again, read these books before you get into your children. Rainbow Valley seems okay for younger children. Real of Ingleside does not. The short stories may vary. It's one of those things where you should probably go through them and see. And they'd probably be great to read to kids. They're just a series of different short stories. And it's a good nighttime read. Age depends on the book, as I said. It'd also be great if you're looking at kind of as similar to my Wizard of Oz review. You have older kids, you're studying the time period, and this gives you a good window into what was being read and the culture and the beliefs of those times, because they were written and popular for people written at the turn of the century, early mid-1900s. Real of Ingleside would probably be a great book if you're studying World War I, because again, it's talking about firsthand experiences by an author who would have had firsthand experience on the home front of World War I, as well as the Spanish flu pandemic. So that's this little edit. Say again, thank you for watching. If you like this, like and subscribe. But we are done for the Anne of Green Gables. Please check out, I do review the films and touch a little bit on the road to Avonlea in another video. Thank you.